of who is buried here. It's certainly the best pictorial record of the gravestones. I looked the other day, and according to that site, I believe there were 380 some burials said to be in the cemetery. I think it's probably a little less because death certificates in Shelby County were deceptive sometimes. More often than not, if they were buried in the Raleigh Cemetery, they said, the place of burial, Raleigh Cemetery. But occasionally they only said Raleigh. And a lot of people have automatically assumed that if they were buried in Raleigh, they were buried in the Raleigh Cemetery. And I don't think that was always the case. A lot of people were, not a lot, but some people were buried on the farm. Or another, like there was another cemetery. I've been told by Tim that there was another cemetery now on the other side of Austin P. I think that one's gone when they widened Austin P. So there were other burial places, but most of the people where it says if they're buried in Raleigh were probably buried here. And of those 380 some burials, there are photographs of 274 stones. And to the best of my knowledge, all the stones that have been found are documented and on that website. Yes, sir.
What's the address for the website?
Find a grave and do a cemetery search.
Put Raleigh Cemetery, it takes you right here. Or if you'll have the name of any grave here, put the name of the person and then just show the cemetery. Find all the graves.
I can show you. I have it back in one of the books over there. When we're done, I can show it to you. All right. I stopped here for a couple of reasons. This is starting what I call the ridge. And this is essentially the oldest section of the cemetery. And it has been one of the most fascinating and frustrating parts of the cemetery. When I first started coming out here, you could not get in this part, almost literally. One day I was down around the Shelby plot, and I got trapped basically in the vines, and I got disoriented, and I lost track of what direction. I freaked out for a moment, and I finally had to stop and orient myself by the sound of the freeway. I thought, okay, the freeway's south, so if I go this way, I'm going to eventually hit the street. But it was that thick out here. And a lot of people, where is Terry over here, did a tremendous amount of work clearing a lot of this ground out. But this section, there has been a treasure trove of stones that have been found. And this is one of them, I think an excellent example of. This stone has been out here since 1859, and it looks almost like it was put out just a few years ago. The etching, the carving is still almost perfect. And I do know a little bit about Asa Thomas. Asa Thomas was a lawyer who came down from Philadelphia and was a lawyer here in Raleigh. And I know just a little bit about him from a book called The Diary of an Old Lawyer by Hallam. And he talks about a story of Asa Thomas. Some guys decided to play a prank on Thomas, and they went in a duel. And, Asa Thomas decided to play the prank. And they had this fake duel, and this guy thought that he'd killed Asa Thomas. And Asa Thomas just disappeared for a few days. There was some fake blood, blah, 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 blah. And Hallam in his book said that Asa Thomas, before the war, went back up to Philadelphia and supposedly disappeared up there. Well, it looks to me like he died in Raleigh, Tennessee on March 26th of 1859. But that stone was buried, and I don't know, it's probably for years and years and years. And one of the benefits of having these stones buried is that they don't weather, and they stay perfect, basically. And the downside of bringing them up as they were originally intended so that they can be seen is that the forces of nature start to work on them, and the rest is history. None of these stones are forever, unfortunately. Nothing is forever. But that one was dug up just a few years ago. This one over here is one of the mystery stones. It's in perfect shape. And if you look at it, there are pieces missing. There were apparently multiple tablets attached to that. You've got part of a date, May 16, 18 something, and November something, but whose gravestone it was, what the complete dates were, where it was. That's essentially where it was found. I don't know. It's one of the holy grails out here is figuring out what that belonged to and who it belonged to. I've never seen anything quite like it. It clearly was not part of a box tomb, so I don't know what that's about. So if you ever figure that out, let me know. What we have behind here in this enclosure is we call this the Rawlings enclosure. It's had a lot of bad luck lately. I'll step over here. Isaac Rawlings was the second mayor of Memphis. The first mayor of Memphis was Marcus Winchester. Mr. Winchester had the misfortune of being buried down in the Winchester Cemetery, and he's still buried down there underneath a city maintenance garage. They never bothered to move the grave when they built the garages down there. But Rawlings was a little more foresightful. He said in his will he did not want to be buried in Memphis. He thought Memphis was dirty, noisy, full of people that he didn't particularly like, and he wanted to be buried out in the country in the fresh air, and he said he wanted to be buried under a willow tree. Well, he didn't get a willow tree, he got an old spruce tree, but he is out here. He passed away in 1839. This enclosure, I don't know at what date this was added, and up to a few years ago this was complete, but clearly this has not been here since the 1830s. But all of the pieces were here, and we came out one day, and this part had just fallen. Somebody came out and lifted it and apparently sold it for scrap metal. So now that's going to have to be replaced. But within this grave site, though, there is Isaac Rawlings. And he was an interesting mayor. Like I said, he was the second, actually he was the second, probably the third, the fourth. He was mayor several times for just a couple of years. You either loved him or hated him. A lot of people didn't like him. He was considered to be crude. He was kind of crusty. He wasn't very neat. He was very controversial and opinionated, but I think most people would agree, and I will agree, that he had the best interests of Memphis at heart. And he was trying to bring it out of that river rat stage into being a legitimate city. He was also controversial when he died, well, actually while he was alive, but when he died, he really pulled one. In that he lived for years very, very openly with a black woman, which was not uncommon in the South. But they did it discreetly. And Isaac Rawlings was not particularly discreet about it. And when he died, there's no record, I've seen no record of what became of the woman, but the child that he had by that marriage, or by that relationship, he freed him. They were both technically his slaves. He freed him. He saw that he was baptized in the Episcopalian Church. He gave him the Rawlings name, and he gave him the rest of his money. And also it's said that he told him to leave the area. And apparently he did, because I've never been able to track the man down. His name was Thomas Rawlings. I've never been able to track him down. So he raised a lot of eyebrows, both alive and dead. Around him, though, here are just various Rawlings relatives, all of them female. There's a female Rawlings here, there are two of them here, and there's another one over there. They were either nieces, sister-in-laws, and I believe one was a cousin. The Rawlings family came to Shelby County from Maryland originally. Isaac was first. Isaac basically was here before Memphis was a city. Memphis was a city, and he spoke the Native American language, and he was like an interpreter at the trading post down along the river, and stayed. Now, what we've got here is sort of a stone graveyard, and that we don't know where these stones go. And I think what's ultimately going to have to happen in the cemetery, I know that there are stones that have been moved, stones that we don't exactly know where they go. And I'm looking at possibly this area in here, because I'm quite sure that there's nobody buried in this area. Ultimately moving them, and if possible, resetting them down there more as cenotaphs, so that their names and their records are in the cemetery, but that it's known that it's not exactly where they are buried. Now the woman here in the middle, it's a broken stone. I don't have the rest of it. I got an email a couple years ago from a guy who said that he had a stone that was taken out of the Raleigh Cemetery in the 70s by a friend, and he wanted to know if I was interested in it. I said, of course. So I went and picked it up, asked no questions. And when I got it, it was hard to decipher, because the name, it was broken off right at the name and the date. But I could tell that it was Sophie W. something, and I could get a date. Well, I assumed, as I was searching the death records, that it was a Caucasian woman. And no matter what I did in Ancestry, on Shelby County Registers, death sites, marriage, I could find nobody. Ultimately, I just, as a lark, popped in race as black, and up she popped. And she was an African-American woman who lived out here, and I don't exactly know where she was buried in the cemetery. But I do know when she died, and I do know that her husband was buried, and this is another one of those cases. Much, much later, he lived on to be some 90-some years old. It says that he was buried, it says she's buried in the Raleigh Cemetery. He's buried in Raleigh. Whether it's here or someplace else, I don't know. But I don't know where Sophie's gravestone goes. She'll probably go with the Jennings to some plot someplace else. But she's the only documented African American that I know about here, and I'm sure there are probably hundreds. I just don't know where. I know that in the South, it was highly unusual for Caucasians and African Americans to be buried in the same cemeteries. I know that there were cemeteries, and I think Raleigh probably was. It was a rural cemetery. Probably was integrated, but it was also segregated within the cemetery. I just don't know where in the cemetery. I have a guess it's over in the corner there for a variety of reasons, but I'll never prove it until I find records for the cemetery, which, by the way, is the Holy Grail. Where are the records to this cemetery? I'm sure there were some at some point. I know there were some at one time. Where are they? I will go to my grave looking for those things. Anyway, we used to call this the stone yard up here. It was such a mess of broken stones. Some of them have just been sort of placed in where we think they might be. There were a series of box tombs out here. There were several of them in here. There's one over there that has been erected that has all of the correct pieces. I'll show it to you when we get there. This one does not have all of the erect pieces. This slab was originally on the ground. But this is Mrs. What's her name? Smith. And her maiden name was DeWoody. Her parents are buried in the cemetery someplace. She was the wife of Robert Smith, who was a clerk at the courthouse out here. She died fairly young. He eventually moved into Memphis and was remarried and is buried at Elmwood. And I know that somewheres in here close, in 1948, there was a smaller slab stone that had her baby sister's name on it. And still haven't been able to find that. There was a woman in 1948, 1949 who came out here, Ida Cooper, and she created sort of a verbal map for those of us that's what I used when I first started coming out here. She didn't even know where the front of the cemetery was, so she just sort of wandered in off the street. And as she started writing, this is the first area that she describes. And she'll describe, say, the Rawlings enclosure. And then she'll say, and then I walked 5 feet to the right. And she'll describe what she saw. So, she's pretty accurate, quite frankly. But sometimes she didn't add enough direction. And when it comes to Baby DeWoody, she just said close by. Well, I don't know where she is, but we haven't been able to find her. Thomas Lee Smith was a merchant in Raleigh in the heyday. I believe he died in the 1840s. His stone is almost worn down, and we have not found all of the pieces to that. That may or may have not been a box tomb. Right. The box tomb was just